closely. Okay. We are at a site called Chorazin, as I'm sure you guys heard Dr. Wright, saw the signs maybe. We're sitting only 2.5 miles north of Capernaum, but notice we're quite a bit higher, right? As soon as you leave the shoreline of the Dead Sea, you rise. The name of the rise that we're on now is the Rosh Pina Sill. It is a black basalt sort of mass that sits right at the bottom of the Hula Basin and sort of blocks the flow of everything coming down the Hula Basin. It's sort of like a geological pebble in the bottom of that funnel that is the Hula Basin. In the same way that sort of economically and politically Hatzor is a pebble in the bottom of the Hula Basin, this is like the geological counterpart to that. And so you'll see the reason that all of the building material here is the black basalt is because that's the resource they had in the vicinity, so that's what they use. So black basalt, coming from those volcanic cones that we saw up on the Golan. This is coming from the belly of that in prehistoric times.
Is it gonna make my pants black?
No, it's black rock. It's not like sooty or anything like that. You're good. Okay, I just imagined all of you standing up with like black bottoms. Okay, joke's on you. I'm just kidding. Chorazin is more or less sort of an out-of-the-way town. It's not really on a main route. There is a main route north of here that goes from the Akko Plain with the natural port going down to kind of just southeast of us to Bethsaida. But it's sort of off of that route, and so it's sort of a medium-sized town, not a huge booming economic center. And it's a Jewish population here, predominantly in the 1st century. In the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbis talk about Chorazin as producing the very best wheat. And they say that they wish that the wheat that was grown here could be used in a temple for the first fruits offering. You always give, after the harvest, they want to offer a portion of that, the first portion of that, the best portion in the temple to God. And they say, we wish that wheat could have come from Chorazin, but it's too far away, so they don't. So there's good sort of resources here that they can use to make a community like this. So that's the Babylonian Talmud. We also read about Chorazin twice in the New Testament, once in Matthew and once in Luke, sort of like parallel stories. So we'll read it from Matthew. And it doesn't show up in the best of light. This is Jesus talking after he's gone around to these villages, started to proclaim who he is, work miracles. He says this in chapter 11, verse 20. Then Jesus began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. He says, woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Down on the Bethsaida plain. We think it's there, just kind of southeast of us here. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. Tyre and Sidon are two sort of powerhouse cities up on the Akko Plain. The port at Akko is taking in all of the trade and economic sort of success that's coming from the Western world, Italy and Greece and Rome and all of these sort of Western powerhouse empires. All of the trade is coming in through Akko, and Tyre and Sidon are certainly reaping the benefits of that. They would be probably predominantly Gentile cities and very concerned with wealth and power and politics. Exactly the opposite, more or less, of the community that you would have here, which would be probably a devout community of Jewish believers. There's a synagogue that is here. They would have been reading the Torah, trying to live out the Torah, things like that. And yet Jesus says it's going to be more bearable for them than for you because you didn't repent when I showed you who I was through these mighty works. And then he keeps going and says, verse 23, and you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades, actually, not to heaven. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. It says the land of Sodom once and then the city of Sodom another time. But we remember that Sodom, Genesis 19, it paints a pretty grim picture of what happened to that city. It talks about how because of what was going on there, the Lord rained down sulfur and fire on the city, and Abraham looks back and he compares it to just a billowing furnace. It was just absolutely destroyed. And yet Jesus says it will be more tolerable for them than for Capernaum, the place we just were, which also had a Jewish community of believers going to synagogue, things like that. Jesus is saying, I've showed you my face. I've proclaimed myself as the prophet, as the Messiah, and yet you have not repented. And this would have been surprising to his Jewish audience. These cities, Tyre and Sidon and Sodom, are Gentile cities mostly. And Jesus is saying they will have a better go of it with regards to punishment, with regards to salvation, than you who have been going to synagogue, reading the Torah, studying it, trying to have a relationship with the Father, following the law. So it would have been really surprising to his Jewish audience, his predominantly Jewish disciples, listening to him say this. There's just something that you don't quite see. I've been telling you who I am, and you don't really get it. You've been studying the Torah, you have been doing this for the sake of relationship with the Father, and yet when you reject me, it shows me you don't really get it. You don't really understand who I am. And I don't think it's a coincidence that right after this, Jesus starts talking about, he thanks the Father that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. You think you get it, but you really don't. And it's actually the little children who get it. And it says a little later, verse 27, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son. You think you understand what you're reading in Torah and who the Father is, but you don't, because if you don't understand what I'm doing, what I'm telling you to repent, then you don't really understand the Father. You have to understand me and accept me in order to get the Father. And we hear this again in John 14, chapter 14:2. Philip is asking, his disciple Philip is asking, Lord, show us the Father, and then that'll be enough for us. And Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? He's saying, I've been showing you the Father the whole time, and you just don't get it. And so Chorazin is one of these cities, devout Jewish community, and they just don't seem to get it, so Jesus denounces them, along with a couple others. So that's where Chorazin shows up in the Bible, sort of as an example of how not to be, right? So then I want to transition to what we're sitting in now. I've heard a couple of different people make a guess, a good educated guess. I heard palace. Any other thoughts? Where are we? What are we sitting in? Does anybody want to take a guess?
Synagogue?
Okay, synagogue. The synagogue is
over there.
right behind us. You guys can go over there later. But right now we're sitting actually in a home. This would have been part of a home, I should say. This is a good example of what a first century Jewish home would have looked like. And so I want to explain it because understanding the architecture of the house is actually can be indicative of what the culture valued. Okay, so things aren't made just for no particular reason. Typically there's a lot of intention behind architecture and things like this, and it's driven by cultural values. So what do we have here? We are sitting in a room. You'll notice that you had to come down that path there and entered into a large courtyard, right? The large cobblestone courtyard, you guys can see it behind you. Do you see it? The big open courtyard space. And then we came through one entrance here and entered into this room, right? And it would have been built up and roofed over. The courtyard maybe not roofed over, but certainly this house would have been roofed over. And you see that there's similar rooms kind of all around the courtyard, right? Similar rooms in shape and size. Can you guys sort of see it? So there's one courtyard, and from that courtyard, you can enter into all these smaller rooms around it. And this is what we call an insula. It's a type of house called an insula. Insula is a Latin word. It means like island or secluded place, protected place. It's an insular place.
How's it spelled?
INSULA. 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 Yes, yes. So the idea is that this is a family dwelling unit. You could call this in Hebrew a Beit Av. Beit meaning house and Av meaning father. So my father's house. And what you would have is many, many generations of family living in this one insula. There's only one entrance into the courtyard, and from that courtyard you can enter into all these houses. The houses, these particular smaller rooms, would belong to certain generations of families. Aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters. All the men in the family would bring in their wives, and the wives would become part of the husband's household. And if the father of the household had daughters, they would go and be a part of their husband's father's households. And so you have generations upon generations living in this one sort of compound. We have found an insula, archaeologically, that had 14 different rooms along the outside of it. That could be up to 5 generations of people living in the same compound. And so what cultural values does this show?
You have to get pretty old to have 5 generations living in one house.
That's true. But they start young, yeah. But the cultural values that this type of living reflects are what?
Family.
Yes, community, togetherness, protection, connectedness in the sense that you know where you're from, you know where you came from, and that is a key way of understanding who you are. So, who am I? I belong in my Father's house. This is my Father's house that I am a part of. You identify yourself based on who your father is. It was a patriarchal society. Yes.
It also occurs to me that, as opposed to how we do, for instance, in Houston, it would be unheard of for a family to stay in one spot for generation after generation. It suggests to me economy and the recognition of the level of effort it would take to construct something like this.
Yeah.
They're going to get the max use out of it.
Yeah.
Over and over.
That's
5
true.
generations, that's a long time.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, part of it was maybe convenience or the economics of it as well. But you have roots here. This is where your lineage is. Remember, Joseph was of the house of David. I mean, how many generations apart was that? And still, there was that memory there in his family and in the town Bethlehem and in the gospel writers. You all know who you are based on where you came from. And so, like Jesus does many times in the New Testament, he uses these very common images and themes in the way he talks. He relates to his audience in that way. He uses very common images, things that everyone would have known at that time. And so he talks about this style of living in John 14. This is during the Passover meal, and remember, prior to this, leading up to this, Jesus and the disciples were up in Caesarea Philippi, the Pontius, and they declared Jesus as the Messiah, and then he resolutely set his face to Jerusalem. He came down to Jerusalem over the Mount of Olives, wept over Jerusalem, and at one point he called it the city that kills its prophets, knowing that he would be one of those that it would kill, right? And then his disciples prepare the Passover meal, and they have the Passover together. And this is one of the things he says at the Passover. Remember, up until this point, he's tried to tell his disciples many times, I'm gonna go, I have to go, I'm gonna die, it's what I have to do. And his disciples either don't believe it, they want to believe that the Messiah will be the one riding into Jerusalem and claiming victory over the Romans. They want to believe it, or they do believe that, or they just don't want to believe that Jesus is gonna go away. Why do you have to go? And so they don't really get it yet, that what Jesus has to do and what that means. And so he says this to them in John 14, verse 1. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house, my Beit Av, my Father's house, are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. So he says, in my Father's house are many rooms. And I can almost guarantee you that at that moment, his disciples would have been thinking about their own Beit Avs, their own families, growing up in a community like this. It would have evoked thoughts of their families and of peace, of protection, of family goodness, things like that. So Jesus is definitely referencing those ideas. But what he's also referencing here, the image that he's using here, is also one of betrothal, actually. How it was in this day when a woman was set to marry a man, the man would go back to his Beit Av, his home, and start preparing a place for him and his wife to come and stay eventually, and start their family, be a part of this community. They would have to come back and literally start building on an addition type of thing, another room. Remember, Jesus was a tecton. He's using also an image of building with stone, another room, right? And so sometimes, depending on the case, the groom, who was going to be married would stay away for even a year or so and be building this place where he could then one day bring his bride. He would go and, after it was finished, he would go collect his beloved and bring her into the Beit Av, and they would become a part of this insula, a part of this community and family, and experience all of those good things that we just talked about, that a community and family and a Beit Av is. But there was a time when they would be split while he was preparing. And Jesus is saying that I'm that groom. I need to go and I need to prepare a place for you in my Beit Av, in my Father's house. There are many rooms. There's enough for all of you. I need to go prepare it. A lot of translations say there's many mansions, or it uses mansions. I think we can get rid of this. It's not an image that the disciples would have related to or really been aware of. I mean, aware of it, but not related to. That's not what Jesus is trying to say. He's saying that I'm the groom, you're my beloved, you're my bride, and we will be together. But first, just like in any culture, in any family, I need to go prepare a place for you. He's telling them that he's gonna die, but that he's not gonna stay there. He'll come back and gather his beloved to him and bring her back. And of course, the beloved is the church. We have this theme even in the Old Testament, Hosea, and also later in the New Testament. So it is another way of Jesus more gently trying to tell them, I have to go, but it's for your good. I'm doing it because I love you, because I want my beloved to be with me. And I might be gone a while. I don't know. The Father knows, not me. I don't know when I'll be back, but I will come back. And that sort of heavenly marriage will take place.
That's a nice image.
Yeah. It is a nice image, I agree. So that is sort of the idea of the insula, of the community here, the Beit Av. We will all be a part of the Beit Av, with a capital A, you could say, one day, the Beit Av. So, Chorazin. Behind me is a synagogue. It dates to the 3rd or 4th century, but typically, like we've seen around the country, if you have a 3rd or 4th century synagogue, it probably means there's a 1st century one underneath it. It's pretty interesting. You can see some interesting symbols and images in the synagogue of maybe some not so Jewish or, not so Jewish images, maybe some Roman pagan images. But you guys are welcome to go and check that out, and then explore the site, and then we'll be doing lunch.
Is it reasonable to assume that Jesus spent at least a fair amount of time here to be so frustrated